Start recording now.
All right, thank you, Carolyn. So good afternoon and welcome to the workshop on preventing and responding to mold in your library, presented by Bex Caswell-Olson from the Northeast Document Conservation Center. My name is Sarah Holstead and I'm the Hospital Library Services Program Manager at Southeastern New York Library Resources Council, located in Highland, New York. Thank you for joining us today. So a quick FYI, in the meeting reminder, you received a link to the workshop handout. Bex will be covering these resources during our time today. So please take a moment to download the document if you haven't already. And after I finish my intro, I will drop the link directly to the handout into the chat. So everybody is entering the meeting muted with your camera off, but you can interact via chat with the comments and questions for the presenter. The chat feature is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you do turn your video on now during the intro, just to wave at people, please consider turning it off during the presentation. This will help with bandwidth for everyone. At this time though, I'd invite you to take a minute and say hello in the chat. I want to let you know that this presentation is being recorded. What you type into the chat will not be recorded with the video. We trust that you'll be courteous and respectful to other attendees and follow the Southeastern Code of Conduct. Anyone who uses the chat in an abusive or threatening way will be removed from this session. This presentation is being live captioned, which you should already see at the bottom of the screen. The caption technology has vastly improved over the last year, but it is not perfect. In fact, none of the technology is perfect, so please enunciate and try not to speak too quickly in case there's a lag in the audio. You can increase the size of the captions in the settings in the accessibility tab. The presentation slides and recording will be posted on the workshop website within a week. I'll drop the URL of today's workshop into the chat in just a minute. We'll also have CE certificates available upon request, and I'll drop that link to the CE request form and the course evaluation form into the chat at the end of the webinar. So the way we're going to handle Q&As, I'll monitor the chat throughout Bex's presentation. So if you have questions, just drop them in. I'll save them. And then we'll do a Q&A session after this, after Bex does her presentation. So preventing and responding to mold in your library is the fifth in a series of 7 workshops about planning for emergencies in your library and community before they happen. It's hard to believe that the grant is wrapping up at the end of April, so I'd like to call your attention to the final events in this series. The next meeting of the Disaster Planning Working Group will be on Tuesday, March 16th. And Dan Wilson, who's the speaker from our previous webinar about continuity of operations planning, will be there to answer your questions and to review your draft plans. You don't have to have attended the previous webinar to come to this working group, so I invite anyone to attend. And you can find the COOP plan template also on the workshop website, and I'm just saving up all these links to drop into the chat. The next 2 webinars are being scheduled for late March and early April. The first one is planning on recovery, and it will feature a panel of library directors from the Hudson Valley, and they'll be talking about the lessons that they learned after experiencing catastrophic events at their libraries. The final webinar is tentatively titled Equity in Planning and Recovery, and the dates and registration links will be announced shortly. Finally, on April 9th, I will be presenting on the highlights of all the webinars from the entire workshop series at CineCon 2021. This is a free online event hosted by Southeastern, where our members can talk about emerging topics and new projects. We had a very successful pandemic prequel last Friday, and I welcome you to register for the April 9th sequel. And again, I'll put that link into the chat. Finally, through this grant, we're offering a free online course developed by the National Library of Medicine and the Medical Library Association to earn a disaster information specialization certification. It takes several weeks to work through this course, and they're online only, but they have to be completed by the end of the grant on April 30th. So if you're interested in doing these courses and you have a lot of time before it gets warm, please contact me if you're interested. This workshop series is funded with the grant from the National Library of Medicine, and I'd like to acknowledge their support. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this material do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Library of Medicine or the National Institutes of Health. I'd also like to acknowledge Carolyn Bennett-Glauda from Southeastern, who's providing support for this series. Thank you. So we started planning for these workshops more than a year ago in February 2020. in response to events that we saw happening at libraries in the southeastern region. This was not a response to the pandemic, but as we've seen over the past year, natural disasters haven't been put on hold for the pandemic. Even without major weather events, closing and reopening libraries in the middle of a pandemic brings whole other layers of stress. The way we experience emergencies or disasters, or even daily pandemic life, is deeply personal, and the trauma is life-altering. I just want to acknowledge the experiences that you all may all be bringing to this workshop, and ask that as speakers or commenters and listeners, we respect the narratives that might be shared today. So one of the focus of these workshops is to help libraries make plans before an emergency or disaster, and also to help libraries get planning resources out into their communities and into the hands of people who can implement them in their homes, so that they can also be prepared. I would like to take a minute to highlight a few of the resources on this slide. These resources are also on the workshop website. And again, I'll give a shout out to the handout that Bex has prepared for this presentation, and I'll drop that link in just a moment. So for communities, resources come from Medline Plus, which is from the National Library of Medicine. They've got a great page that's an overview of molds. And I would also call your attention, especially to the mold image library from FEMA. It doesn't have just pictures of blobs. It has great images of mold damage in businesses, in homes, and it's also got pictures of successful remediation and successful prevention, steps basically that you do with your house or your pipes in your house. Other good resources are from the CDC about how to clean up after mold. And then just a good overview from the EPA, an overview of mold, and also from the New York Department of Health. For libraries, I picked some resources that are more geared towards businesses. So the New York Department of Labor has a new mold program that's all about enforcing the new mold law. And then there are also some resources from OSHA, and Bex is going to delve into a couple of those. The Northeast Document Conservation Center, where Bex is from, also has some great pamphlets. And then the Documentary Heritage and Preservation Services for New York has some disaster planning resources. And I would finally call your attention to another free course from the National Library of Medicine, which is the In Case of Emergencies Continuity of Operations Planning. And again, it's free, and it was actually developed and presented by our presenter from the previous webinar. So with that, again, thank you for being here today, and I will turn the presentation over to Bex. Just remember to put your questions into the chat, and we'll catch up with you after the presentation. Thank you so much, Bex, and welcome.
Thank you. All right, so let me go ahead and share. All right, so everyone can see that now, and that looks right?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, great. For some reason for me, it's doing something weird, so just give 1 sec, sorry.
No worries. And so while you're doing that, I will just call out that I popped the link to the LibGuide and the mold handout in the chat, so people can click on that.
Perfect. Okay, I got it now. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited. So again, my name is Bex Caswell-Olson, and I'm the Director of Book Conservation here at the Northeast Document Conservation Center, or NEDCC, located in Andover, Massachusetts. And today we're going to talk about preventing and responding to mold in your library. So as Sarah mentioned, I have a resource list that I've created. I'm going to refer to that a couple times today. So before I dive in, let's just do a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. So first, I want to tell you why mold is a threat to collections and also to us for our health. Then we can take a look at some examples of things that may or may not be mold, and you can kind of test your knowledge, and we can do some visual identification. Then we can talk about when you do have mold, what do you do about it? And then we'll talk about preventing mold. And there will be time at the end for questions. If you could hold your questions to the end, that would be great. If you just can't, you can go ahead and type it in the chat, but I probably won't get to it until the end. All right, so why is mold a threat to our collections? Well, so let me just preface this and say that mold is in the air all around us all the time, and it's usually not a problem. So sometimes I do get a lot of questions from people who are like, I think I might have mold, but I can't see it. What do I do? And it's like, well, you do have mold and you can't see it because mold is everywhere all the time. So I say that not to scare you, but just to let you know that we don't live in a sterile environment, and we don't actually want to live in a sterile environment. Mold actually has some very beneficial purposes in nature. So for instance, it helps to break down dead wood and dead leaves in the environment, creating essential nutrients for plant growth. There are things like penicillin, which is a life-saving medication that is made from mold. And without mold, we would not have things like blue cheese. So not all mold is bad. The amount of mold that is in the air around you at any given time is going to depend on your geographic location, if you're inside or outside, and the time of year. So if you are like me and you have an allergy to leaf mold, you might really notice this in the fall when there's more leaf mold around, but generally the rest of the year, this is something that you might just completely not notice. So mold only really becomes a problem for people and for collections when it's present in high concentrations. And so, well, what does a high concentration mean? That actually really depends. It's going to depend on the type of mold, your individual threshold and tolerance for mold, and again, the time of year, and if you're inside or outside. So because it can vary so much, there are no federal standards, either OSHA or otherwise, that dictate what safe indoor air quality for mold is. But what OSHA does regulate is how you need to treat and handle mold in the workplace to do so safely, and what sort of protections your employer has to provide. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So mold does have some serious, present some serious health risks or health concerns. Active mold, which is actively growing mold, is going to be more likely to produce symptoms or reaction, but inactive mold can also produce a reaction in some people, or actually in many people. And the sort of effects of mold that we're going to feel can include skin irritation or a rash. You can have allergic symptoms that mimic hay fever, so like itchy eyes, runny nose, even a cough or congestion. Less commonly, you can get an infection, and that would be something that is going to be in your lungs. And then I would say for humans, rarely toxicity, which would be poisoning. So even people who don't typically have allergies can be more allergic to things like mold. And allergies can develop as the result of overexposure. So if you expose yourself to too much mold, you can develop an allergy that can really impact your life. I think everybody always needs to treat mold seriously, but especially so if you have an allergy, if you have asthma or other respiratory problems that affect your breathing, if you are pregnant, or if you are immunocompromised, because especially immunocompromised persons are more likely to develop something called an invasive infection. And that's, again, something that would happen in your lung. And that can be very, very serious, potentially fatal. And if you want to kind of really keep yourself up at night, there's a link to a CDC publication on invasive infections in immunocompromised people that you should definitely check out. I would say, though, that invasive infections and toxicity are going to be somewhat more rare, but absolutely possible. So I know all of that sounds like really, really scary, and people sometimes get really scared of mold. And I would say, I don't think that mold is something that you need to be afraid of, but it is something that you need to take seriously. And as long as you take the necessary precautions to protect yourself, this is something that you can certainly handle and work with in a safe way. And we'll talk about that today. So in terms of our collections, mold poses a number of threats, and the biggest one is mold damage. And the kind of damage that mold can cause is irreversible. And it tends to affect organic materials like paper, cloth, or leather, exactly the kind of materials that you are likely to find in a library. And that damage can include staining, weakening, or even just loss of the material. Because as mold grows, it produces enzymes that digest organic material and really basically like literally eat away at it, which is what's happened to the book in this picture, which is kind of severe and alarming. And so, but again, you don't really, this is really going to happen more on organic materials. Mold does not, you don't typically see mold growing on things like metal or plastic or glass because there's really nothing there for it to eat, to digest. However, mold can grow in dust. And so if those surfaces are dusty, it can grow on that. And so that's just also a very good argument for regularly cleaning your stacks. So active mold can spread very quickly, causing a larger outbreak in the right conditions. And if that happens, you might need to call in a professional company for assistance because this can be a pretty serious endeavor to clean up a major mold outbreak. Depending on the scale of the problem, that could mean closing to the public for a period of time while that mold remediation is happening. And for a lot of institutions, that's just an absolute non-starter. And hiring an outside company can also be quite costly, as is the need to replace carpet, drywall, furniture, etc., if these things are contaminated. Again, I don't want to scare people because I would say that having a problem that as severe as what's happening in this photo here, it's not the kind of problem that's going to creep up on you over time. It's more likely to be the result of some sort of disaster, a water event, a leak, a flood, or etc., that has caused materials to be wet for a period of time. And if you're unable to dry those things out, then that can really turn into a large scale mold problem. But again, so a small problem of a small number of actively moldy things can spread rapidly if they're allowed to do so. And so that's why kind of catching them and dealing with the problem early on is really, really beneficial. And then maybe kind of the most annoying thing about a mold outbreak is that even once you've gotten it under control and mitigated everything, there's always the possibility that mold can come back. So if you don't change the environment, if you don't change, solve the problem of why the mold happened in the first place, it's prone to a rebloom, and that can be really problematic. So one thing to know is that inactive mold is not dead, it's just dormant, and that if it's allowed to, in an environment that is maybe damp or warmer, it can start to grow again. And that's actually what's happened to the books in this picture. These things had been part of a mold outbreak. They were cleaned and set aside, but the initial problem, which was that a leak in the roof, was not resolved, and they weren't moved to a new location, and nothing was done to control the environment. And so within, only a few days of being cleaned, mold started to grow again. So again, controlling your environment and kind of preventing a mold outbreak in the first place is really key. So now that we know sort of why mold is not something desirable to have, let's talk a little bit more about how to identify mold, because there are a lot of things out there that look similar but aren't mold. So mold is a multicellular organism, and it typically grows from outwards from a central point. It's usually kind of in a circular pattern for that reason. It's going to spread out from the center seeking new nutrients. And it's going to have a fuzzy raised appearance. It could be also either like felty or hairy. The center can be lots of different colors. It could be green, black, brown, blue, yellow, red, really any color that you can imagine. So sometimes we hear about something called black mold, and I just want to clarify that black mold is just another way of saying toxic mold. Not all mold that's black is toxic, and not all toxic mold is black. So that's just something to know. So the newest growth around the edges is generally like a white kind of hair-like appearance, and these are filaments. And those are called hyphae. And those are basically like the feelers that the mold is putting out as it's searching for nutrients. It's searching for a place to grow. So, and you'll sometimes see mold grow in one direction or another, depending on what it's finding and what it thinks is the most delicious, nutritious thing that's going to support its germination. So active mold is going to be wet and or at least feel kind of wet or damp and possibly smear when you touch it. Whereas inactive mold is going to be dry and powdery. So now that we know a little bit about what mold looks like and about how it grows, let's take a look at some examples, and you guys can tell me if you think that they're mold or not. You can either type your answer into the chat, or you can say it out loud to yourself. You can send it to me telepathically. Those are all of those work. So here is our first example, and I will give you guys a hint. So these kind of reddish brown spots on there, they're totally flat and they really appear to be like embedded into the paper. They're not something that's sitting on the paper. So I'll give you guys 1 second to guess. I see maybe some answers in the chat. So this is not mold. This is something called foxing. And foxing, again, it's going to be in the paper, not on the paper. It does not weaken the paper or damage it. I mean, it's aesthetically, it's not particularly attractive, but it's not harming the paper in any way. And so it's not really a cause for concern. It's not something that can really easily be removed in any way by surface cleaning or something like that. The only way to really remove this maybe possibly is through some more invasive conservation treatment like washing or even light bleaching. So it's something that we really reserve just for works of art on paper and generally not for books. No one's really sure exactly what causes foxing. It could be rust, it could be fungal growth in the paper from the time of manufacture, but what we do know is that it tends to appear when things are stored in an overly humid environment. And once it appears, it doesn't go away. So the best thing to do is to prevent foxing before it happens, which is to keep it in an environment that's generally under 50% humidity. All right, here's the next example. So I will give you some hints on this one. So this looks kind of, it is on top of the paper, that's for sure, but it's maybe more granular looking. It's not necessarily, it doesn't really look fuzzy to me. Any guesses? So if you said that this is not mold, you would be correct. So this is actually just really like heavy caked on surface dirt. And you'll notice that the areas where this substance is, it's not really round. It doesn't really have a central point or like a colony formation. It's just kind of everywhere all over the page. And even though it's on the paper, it looks kind of flat as opposed to like fuzzy or felty. All right, this is a tricky one. So I will give you guys a couple hints. The first one is that these things got wet perhaps in the last hour, maybe even half hour of when this picture was taken, and they are located on the top shelf. So any guesses? I feel a few psychic guesses coming to me. So if you said that this is not mold, you would be correct. So what's happened here is that these things, since they were on the top shelf, water was coming down from the ceiling and the drop ceiling tile just got so saturated that it crumbled and left this white cakey gross stuff everywhere. And this is actually something that I see unfortunately quite a lot. And so that's always a good hint, is if after a water event to look up at your ceiling tile and see what it has done. And I'll say it's kind of yucky. Like when it dries, it can really like stick things together like glue. It's not my favorite. But so one thing we know is that mold needs 24 to 48 hours to germinate once it's kind of given the opportunity. And so since these things only had just gotten wet, I can feel very confident that they're not mold. Okay, this is kind of a tricky one. This is like a white crystalline substance. It kind of almost looks like salt. And it's something that you would only see on leather or sometimes like a starchy book cloth, like a library buckram. Any guesses? This is a tricky one. All right, I'm going to give it away. This one is not mold. This is something called efflorescence. And so again, this is something that can appear typically on leather, but also on like really starchy library buckram that has a lot of like wax in it. And when it's too humid, salts and fats and things that are in either the leather dressing or in that starchy book cloth can rise to the surface, creating this white crystalline product. So efflorescence is a word that you might also know if you're at all familiar with masonry, or if you have like a cinder block wall. If too much moisture is coming through, salts can crystallize on the surface. It's the same kind of thing. So it's not particularly attractive, but it is otherwise harmless, and it's something that you can generally just wipe off. If it's a cloth book, you can wipe it off with like a damp cloth. On a leather book, I would use just a dry cloth to wipe it off. All right, here's another tricky one. So on both of these books, there's definitely signs of old water damage, but it's definitely dry. And I don't really see anything raised on the paper. We could consider this one maybe a trick question. So this is not mold, but it's damage that's been caused by mold. So the one on the left, the paper is really pulpy, and it's actually fused together in some places because of the mold damage. And there's really sadly nothing that can be done about that once it's happened. Like those layers really are maybe not able to be separated. And on the right, we have stains that are caused by mold, which are very often like this purple or pinky purple, and they're round. And that's again from the enzymes produced by the mold can really stain that paper, and that is generally not considered to be reversible. So if I saw something like this, I would just want to really carefully check these volumes for other signs of mold before I proceeded, but this doesn't necessarily mean there's mold there. It means there was mold there at one time, but it might not be there anymore. All right, so what about this one? Oh. All right, so this one's definitely mold, but it's inactive mold. So inactive mold is if you could reach through the computer and touch this, you would be able to feel that this is dry and powdery, but it does have like this raised fuzzy appearance. And just remember that active mold can become active again under the right conditions, and that it can also cause allergic symptoms in quite a large amount of the population. So it's something that I would want to handle with care, and I'd want to proceed with cleaning this, which don't worry, we'll get to that. All right, what do you guys think about this one? So there's 3 different spots I'm looking at, and I have some arrows pointing to them. And while you're all thinking about it, I'm just going to take a quick sip. All right. So, not mold, but also mold. So the stuff up at the top is just dirt that's kind of caked on. There's a purple mold stain there in the middle. And then down at the bottom, that raised black fuzzy stuff is inactive mold. Okay, I don't think I need to give anybody any hints or any time on this one. This one is definitely mold. And so this is some active mold. It's hairy, it's fuzzy, it's wet, it's smeary. And again, this can spread really quickly. So this is the kind of damage that if I saw this happening, I'd want to address this as quickly as I possibly could. And I'd want to look at nearby items, nearby books, the shelving, carpeting, furniture, anything that's kind of in close proximity to this to make sure that it hadn't spread. And of course, I'd want to wash my hands and clean surfaces after handling anything like this. All right, so now that we kind of have a better idea of what to look for when we're looking for mold, let's talk about how we're going to deal with mold. So here is my plan of attack. I made this fun little flow chart. So first things first, I want to take whatever safety precautions I need to take, and I'll talk about that in a second. Then I want to assess the mold and determine, is it active or inactive? Because that's really going to tell me what my next steps are. So if it's active mold, I want to find and stop the cause. Then I want to stop the mold growth. Once it's inactive, or if the mold is already inactive, then I can proceed with cleaning it. And then I want to make sure that I take steps to prevent mold from coming back in the future. So like I said, safety first, because mold can cause a variety of health problems. It is very important that you protect yourself when handling mold. And just one thing that you really need to remember, I already mentioned this, but is that you can develop an allergy to mold as the result of overexposure. And that has happened to me personally, and I don't recommend it. So take precautions. How much PPE, or personal protective equipment, you need is going to depend on the scale of the problem. And OSHA has some good information in their publication called the Guide to Handling Mold in the Workplace that gives you an idea of kind of the size of a problem and what sort of PPE you need to wear in that situation. But I will say also, use some common sense. So if I, for instance, if I was at home and I opened my refrigerator and I found that my strawberries went moldy, I would not go put on like a Tyvek hazard suit and goggles and a mask and gloves to throw those out. But if my entire kitchen was covered in mold from, floor to ceiling, that's a different story. And I'm going to maybe take some stronger precautions. So you can just kind of use some common sense about scale of the problem and how much protection you need. But whatever, for most situations, your PPE should include some kind of protective clothing. That could be a lab coat, it could be an apron, it could be a Tyvek hazard suit if you feel that you need that. It could even just be like a long sleeve shirt that you put on over your clothes. The idea is that this is something that you can take off when you leave the area where there is mold and leave there, that so that you are not then getting it on your clothes and bringing it into other places of parts of your building, to your car, or to your home. We wear PPE to protect ourselves, but also to avoid transferring contaminants from one area to the other. You want to wear some sort of disposable glove. I really like nitrile gloves because I think you have a better tactile experience. You can really feel what you're touching, which is not as true for like cheaper kind of vinyl gloves that you might use in food service. Oops, too far. Okay. But so I really, really prefer nitrile gloves. Then you need to have some sort of respiratory protection, and that is approved for use with mold. And this is really important, and I'm going to talk more about that in the next slide because I have lots to say about it. If you have a significant amount of mold, it's a great idea to wear safety goggles because, again, it can produce allergic symptoms, and those can happen in your eye. And so if you're getting it into your eye and into your respiratory system through your eye, you're going to have a reaction. So having some safety goggles that have a good seal on your face that are not vented is a great idea. It's also a great idea if you have long hair to put your hair back, if you have a scarf or a tie or any loose clothing to tuck that in. A very important point that I want to make, again, don't wear your PPE out of your work area. So, even if you have to run to the restroom or something, you need to take it off and leave it there. Things like disposable masks and disposable gloves are single-use items, so they are a one and done situation. I know a lot of people really want to try to reuse gloves and especially masks, either because they feel bad about making extra trash and waste, and they, for environmental reasons or for financial reasons. But really, these things are designed to be used once and discarded, not to be reused. If you're concerned about the environmental impact, I do have a link in the resource list to some PPE recycling programs that you can look into that are pretty inexpensive and worth it if you go through a lot of this kind of thing. And maybe even it's just a good idea, since I think lots of people are wearing PPE right now for other reasons, is potentially an option that you want to look into. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about respiratory protection. So this respiratory protection has to be approved for use with mold, and OSHA has some guidelines on this. So a surgical mask or a cloth face covering is not enough. It does not provide adequate protection against mold. You do really need something that has a tight seal on your face, like an N95 mask or There are a couple other models, but 95 or 100 should be after whatever letter is there, because that's going to filter out 95% of particulates, and that's what you're looking for. And it's really important that your mask fits correctly. So everyone's face is a different size and different shape. And if you don't have a good seal, then your mask isn't going to do what it needs to do. I think disposable N95 masks come in a lot of different styles. And like as someone who wears glasses, I find this style that's shown in the center here with a rigid front to not work very well for me, because it pushes my glasses up far on my face, and I actually wear progressives. And so then I can only see out of the close vision part of my glasses, and I can only see for about 6 inches. Not very helpful. But they do make a style that has like a soft front that I find a lot more comfortable for wearing with glasses, and just more comfortable for longer periods of time anyway. So find the fit and the style that work for you. You can also wear a half-face respirator that has disposable cartridges, and you'd want to be using a particulate cartridge. And for something like that, I would especially recommend that you get fit tested again, just to make sure that you're wearing the right, the one that fits you the best. So fit testing is something I just recommend for everyone. And in fact, for workplace use, not for home use, but for workplace use, OSHA does require that even for disposable N95 masks. Fit testing sounds scary, but it's actually really simple. And it's something that you can even buy a kit and do yourself if that is, necessary for you. But you could also talk to your local OSHA office about other options for having a third party do that. But basically, fit testing just will make sure that your mask is fitting correctly, and they can even help make recommendations for a good model for you. So I have a link in the resource list that just explains a little bit more about fit testing and what's involved and why it's necessary, that I would encourage you to look at. I also have a link to a video made by 3M that's up on YouTube that shows the proper way to put a mask on and to do a seal check. So if nothing else, just make sure you're doing a seal check. Basically, if you have a mask on and you breathe sharply, like really hard, and you feel air leaking out, it's not fitting correctly. Again, for someone like me who wears glasses, this is really obvious that if your mask is fitting right or not. If you just normal breathing, so not like labored breathing, but just normal breathing, if it makes your glasses fog up, it means that you don't have a good seal. But check that video out. It's very helpful. And then again, putting your mask on and off correctly is really important. What we're trying to do here with the mask is cover our mouth and our nose and prevent contaminants from getting in there. And so if you take it off in a fashion where then you end up touching your face or touching too much, the front of the mask and contaminating things, it's doing you absolutely no good. So I have a great handout from the CDC that has some wonderful illustrations about how to properly put on and take off a mask so that you're putting it on properly and taking it off properly. All right, I'll get off my mask soapbox now. So now that we've put on our PPE and we're ready, we feel safe and we're ready to go, we can start to assess our mold. So again, the first thing I want to do is determine if the mold is active. So that would be actively growing. And remember, that's going to be like wet and smeary, or if it's inactive. So if it's dormant, dry and powdery, because this is going to tell me what I need to do next. Active mold is a much more serious and time-sensitive problem. So like if it's 4:45 on Friday and you find active mold, too bad. Your Friday night is going to be a little bit less fun. If it's 4:45 on Friday and you find inactive mold, that's something that can probably wait until Monday. Especially if you can freeze it, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So if it's active mold, you need to figure out why it's growing, what has caused it, because mold really needs moisture to grow. It's not just going to even though it is in the air around us all the time, it's not going to germinate unless it has the right conditions. So did these things get wet? Something I've definitely seen more than once is like it's raining and somebody got their books wet and then dropped them in the book drop and they sat there over the weekend and then they're moldy. That's always a bummer. But so are there signs of water damage nearby? Do you see a leak or anything like that? Is there something that needs to be addressed? Do you need to turn off water? Do you need to call facilities, etc.? Or maybe it's a situation like where it's the peak of summer and it's really humid and your HVAC died over the weekend and it was like a holiday weekend and nobody knew and it's a total swamp in your space now and you've got mold. So is that something that you need to address? Do you need to bring in a humidifier or an air conditioner? Then I want to look at the scale of the problem. So how many things here are affected? Is it just one or two? Is it a whole bay? Is it a whole aisle? Is this a problem that I can handle myself, or do I need to think about calling in a vendor to help me? Are the walls, carpet, furniture, other things like that affected? So, how big of a problem you can handle in-house is really going to depend on your staff, your space, what kind of equipment that you have. So that's a call that everybody kind of has to make for themselves, whether or not you have a conservation lab or a conservator that's able to help you. But I would say in general, if it's more than like 100 items or 10 bankers boxes, that's a good time to think about calling a vendor for help, something that's more than you can reasonably handle yourself. Then I want to think about, I want to assess my materials. So are these moldy items part of a circulating collection that I know I can pretty easily replace? And is it better to just withdraw and discard them? Or are these things part of a reference collection or archive or special collection that I really do need to keep? Or maybe it's just something that's out of print or, very, very expensive to replace. So do I really want to spend the effort on mold remediation? Because that can be quite time consuming and it can be costly. So I just want to think about that before I dive in whole hog. And before I can proceed with cleaning anything, because it's not really safe to clean active mold, you need to stop the mold growth. So isolating, if it's just a few things, isolating those materials. If it's a larger area, isolating that area, getting that as cold and dry as possible, because mold really needs moisture to grow and it likes warmth because warmth contributes to humidity. So if you can get it cold and dry, that's the best thing. Make sure that there's good airflow in the area. And if you can't freeze things out, or if you can't dry things out quickly, then you can freeze them, and freezing will also help stop mold growth. And I will tell you more about that in just a second. But I do want to pause just for a moment and say that if you find yourself in a disaster situation where you have a leak or a flood or an active mold outbreak and you don't remember everything that I just said in the last slide and you need help, that NEDCC has a free emergency help hotline that's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And thank you very much, NEH, for funding that. And so we're always on call to help and to talk you through a problem. We also have a great disaster assistance page on our website that has a resource list, and it has a list of vendors that you can call if you don't already have somebody identified. So I just wanted to put that out there so that you don't start to feel like you're panicking. Remember that we are here for you. All right, so back to stopping the mold growth, because this is really important. Freezing is really the best way and easiest way to do that for most people. Ideally, you want to do this in a dedicated freezer, and hopefully it's a frost-free freezer. Frost-free is not essential, but it's great because it does kind of help remove moisture from the items, and this is especially helpful if the books are wet. This is something you can do in-house, or you can have a vendor do it. A lot of disaster response companies can even pack things up for you and freeze them either offsite, or if you have a really, really massive disaster, which I hope doesn't happen to you, they can bring refrigerator trucks to you. When I'm preparing things to freeze, I like to wrap them in either freezer paper or wax paper or deli wrap to prevent them from sticking together. But I don't want to put them in plastic bags. And the reason I don't want to put them in plastic bags, well, one, we just don't need more plastic in the environment. But two, when you go to defrost them later, especially if they were wet and there's moisture in there, you're just creating like a microclimate that's going to be great for more mold growth. It's like a little terrarium in that plastic bag. So just freezer paper or deli wrap is enough to keep them from getting stuck together. And you can also then label and date things right on the freezer paper, which is very helpful. I also recommend keeping a log of the things that you put in a freezer, just so you know what's in there and how long it's been in there. And then I would say freezing is safe for most things, but not for like vellum or parchment or magnetic media. So any sort of audiovisual materials, photographic materials, or film. If you have those things, you should call a conservator or disaster response company for more assistance, but those things will not do well with freezing. And then once things are frozen, the mold growth is going to cease. I would say you need to leave it in there for like at least 48 hours. You need it to really fully freeze, but I would leave it there for 1 or 2 weeks, just to be safe. And that buys you some time. You know, as long as they're in the freezer, you don't really have so much to worry about. If you can't freeze things, either because there are kind of material you can't freeze or you just don't have any sort of freezer available to you, you can just make sure that things get dried out, because mold does need moisture to grow. So even if they're not actually wet, you just need to dry them out so that the mold gets dried out and is desiccated. If you do have things that are wet, though, I'll say air drying takes a little bit longer than freezing. And so one disadvantage of that, especially if it's like summer and it's really humid and it is harder to dry things out, is that some mold might continue to grow. It's not going to stop it quite as quickly. All right, so once things are in the freezer or isolated and drying out, you want to just go back to whatever that area was and clean your surfaces down. I really like a 1-to-1 solution or 50-50 solution of just regular bleach and water. And so this is fine for shelving and other hard surfaces, book trucks, things like that. But please, please, please do not use this on your collections materials. It's also a great idea to change your HVAC filters if you have an HVAC system after a mold outbreak, because there are particulate filters and that will catch the mold. And just switch those out, and getting a fresh start is a great idea. If you have a really, really bad mold outbreak, which again, I hope never happens to you, it's also a great idea just to do like a duct cleaning service, just to make sure that you're not, things aren't hiding elsewhere in your building. And then if necessary, if like upholstered furniture or carpet nearby was affected, definitely have that cleaned very, very thoroughly, or just replaced if that's possible for you. All right, so let's say either you found inactive mold, which I think is more common. That seems to be what people come across more often. Or you've made your active mold inactive because you've frozen it or dried it out. So again, let's just remember that inactive mold is dormant, not dead. And so it can begin growing again if it's in the right conditions. So while it's something I want to take care of, it's not something I have to take care of immediately. So that inactive mold, it's going to be dry and powdery, and I might see stains or signs of other mold damage that I may or may not be able to do anything about. The best way to remove mold is by vacuuming. And I have on the slide, I say that you're removing mold spores. That's not really true. What you're actually removing, what you actually are seeing, are the fruiting bodies produced by mold as it grows. That the spores, like I said, they're in the air. Wherever you are right now, you have mold spores in the air all around you, and you can't really see them. So what you're seeing is actually like the fruiting bodies. So when you are vacuuming mold, you want to make sure you are using a vacuum with a high efficiency particulate air filtration system, or also known as HEPA. And so basically what that is going to do is really filter out those mold particulates so that they do not recirculate into your room. If you are using a regular household vacuum, you know, and it vents, it sucks air in, but it has to also put it out. A regular household vacuum filter is not good enough, and you will end up just putting mold back into your space. If you don't have a HEPA vacuum on hand and you only have a regular household vacuum, that's okay. You just need to make sure that when you are cleaning materials that you're working outdoors. When you're shopping for a vacuum, if you can look for one that has variable speed controls, and those basically allow you to turn the suction up and down. And when you're cleaning books and paper, a lower suction is generally more appropriate. I also really like this micro tool attachment system that's shown in that bottom picture. And you can buy that on Amazon for less than $10. And I think it's probably the most useful way of spending $10. That it's perfect. It's great for like keyboards, for small spaces. It's just, I don't know, I have one at home and I love it so much. So when you are vacuuming, again, you need to take your safety precautions and be wearing all the necessary personal protective equipment, whether you're working inside or outside. If you can work inside a fume hood, that's really if you're inside and you can work inside a fume hood, that's great. I realize that that's something that is not available to the vast majority of people, and that's okay. So if you really truly have to work inside, then you could work like by an open window with a fan that's blowing things outside, but just please don't work in an enclosed space with mold. And again, working outside is also an option, but I realize that that's weather permitting. When you are vacuuming, you want to be careful you're not causing damage to the item, and so you need to work from like the center or the spine out. And here is what that looks like. So when you are using this vacuum attachment, it really should be like hovering over the item, not touching and scraping it, because you don't want to cause abrasions or tears. And you'll see that like on the top of this book, I'm working from the spine outwards. On the foredge, I'm working from the middle out. And when I'm working in the gutter, same thing from the middle up. A soft brush can be used to kind of help, especially if mold's kind of stuck, which it can sometimes be. You can use a soft brush to kind of loosen it and or brush it towards a vacuum cleaner attachment, and that's really helpful like when you're working in the gutter. I try to use dedicated tools for mold removal, so you'll notice that the brush I'm holding in that last photo says mold on it, and that's something that we have here that we use for mold and only for mold. And then I like to clean my tools afterwards with a 50-50 solution of water and bleach. For the brushes, I probably don't do that. That is a little harsh, just soap and water, but I want to clean them afterwards is my point. And so if you're doing an open book, again, from the center out, maybe kind of think about this Union Jack pattern. When I get to the edge, I'm gonna like lift up slightly so that I make sure I'm not accidentally snagging the edge of the paper. And just working slowly. It's not necessarily a race. When you're finished, one thing I do recommend is either marking the volume or like adding a note to the catalog to indicate that it was cleaned, how you cleaned it, and the date. And this is going to do two things. One, it's going to, if there are like mold stains and other mold damage, it's going to prevent you from being like, oh no, I didn't know about this, and re-cleaning the same book over and over and over again. And two, if you do see mold growing again, it's going to help you track a recurring mold problem and the date of the initial cleaning and follow-up cleaning. So that's just something helpful to do if you are able to. All right. So now let's talk a little bit about preventing mold. So we've talked about a couple times how mold really needs moisture to grow, and it really thrives in warmer conditions. And so controlling the temperature in our storage spaces is really key, and also the humidity. And if you have the ability to also monitor your temperature and humidity over time, and that way you can, help make sure it doesn't reach undesirable levels. So best practices for storage of books and paper says temperature should be between 55 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Obviously 55 is, if it's an area where you have staff working, that's a little too chilly. You'd want to be closer to the 70 degrees. But really not above 70 if possible. and a relative humidity of 30 to 50%. Anything over 50%, you are at much greater risk for mold growth. And if you're up in the 70, 80, 90%, I mean, if it's 100%, it's raining in your building. But anything over 50% really, it exponentially increases your risk of mold growth. It also actually increases your risk of pests. So that's a good thing. However, I do realize that, especially if you don't have air conditioning or if you have an older building, that these targets might be really, really difficult for you to reach. So these are the ideal, but we don't necessarily live in an ideal world. And I'm very aware of that. But this is something that you could think about after a water event, the sort of conditions that you would want if you had a wet building and wet materials. Really, really, please keep those in mind. If you don't already have an environmental monitoring program, think about starting one. This is really helpful to have just one to have a handle and some knowledge on your storage environment. And it's also great if you are trying to make a case for a new HVAC system or to have air conditioning, to have data on hand that can really demonstrate why it's necessary. Anyway, in general, in our collection storage areas, besides having a great environment, we want to make sure that we're not storing things like directly on the floor or up against an exterior wall, especially like if you're in a basement or something that's going to be more prone to dampness or more prone to leaks. But if things are on the floor and water's coming up through the floor, they're going to get wet. If things are on the floor and water's coming down from the ceiling, they're still going to get wet. So we never recommend storing materials on the floor if at all possible. Again, if things get wet, you do have 24 to 48 hours before mold is going to start to germinate. And so making sure that you keep the temperature as low as possible, colder is better, humidity below 50%. Something you can't see in this photo because it's just off to the right a little bit out of frame is there are fans blowing in that room to keep everything going. So keeping some air moving, drying things out as fast as possible, and freezing them. And hopefully we can prevent water problems before they happen. And the best way to do that is just by doing some proactive maintenance and regularly inspecting and repairing certain parts of your building. So things like roofing and flashing, gutters and drains, plumbing, your fire suppression system, because of course sprinklers have water in the line, and maintaining your HVAC system. You want to avoid storing your collections directly under exposed pipes or ductwork if you can, at all possible. If you know you have a problem area, I think everybody in their building knows, like, oh yeah, if it's raining really hard, on the 4th floor over on the east side, that corner leaks. Try not to store materials there if you know that's a problem area. It's also a great idea to have an updated disaster plan with current vendor contact information. So if something does happen, you know who to call. And I want to say that I have personally responded to disasters, water incidents that are the result of not maintaining every single one of these things on this list. So I know that sometimes when places are in a financial pinch, they will start to forego regular maintenance. And I would say that never ever saves money in the long run. It always leads to a problem down the line. And so, if you can avoid doing that, please do. I also think it's a really good idea to do regular walkthroughs of your building to look for signs of trouble, especially on days when you have like if there's a really bad storm coming. Maybe if you're going to close for a long weekend for a holiday, doing it before you close for the weekend, and maybe doing it after you come back from a long weekend. Just, looking for signs of problems so you can catch them when they're small. It's also a really good idea to monitor problem areas. So again, if I know that I have like a place where things leak or a window leaks every time there's a really heavy storm, if there's a heavy storm, I want to go check on that and make sure that I find it before it's been going on for too long. If you do have an area that has had a mold outbreak in the past, it's a great idea to keep a log of either that call number range or those shelves and just kind of check on them periodically, maybe on a monthly basis or more frequently if it's like really warm and humid, like it might be in the summer. And then for some of those like problem leaky areas, water alarms are a great way of helping alert you to problems, especially if this is something that happens like in an unstaffed area or a place that you just don't go a lot. And the old fashioned water alarms were kind of a pain. The newer ones can be connected to Wi-Fi. They're pretty cheap. You can, like $25 or something like that. And they can be connected to Wi-Fi, and they can either email you or send you a text message to alert you when they sense moisture. So that can just be really helpful, especially if you are closed or if you have an unstaffed storage location. And then it's a great idea to quarantine and inspect all new acquisitions for signs of mold and also for pests, and before things are processed and introduced into the collection, and clean them before you shelve them if you do find something, because we don't want to bring things from outside into the collection. I would say for new acquisitions, like if you're getting things directly from the publisher, that's going to be less likely to be a problem. But if you are buying historic materials or you are accepting donations, like for your local history room or something, and these are the kind of things that people have been storing in their basement or their attic, and they are more prone to having some pre-existing issues, try and catch those before you just put them in the rest of your collection. And then the last thing I want to say is, I know this last year has been really different and difficult for a lot of us, that a lot of places had to close back in last March, almost a year ago now. And some places are still closed, or they are only working with a reduced schedule or with reduced staff. And I feel like very, very few people either had a disaster plan or a plan for continuity of operations that really dealt with a situation like the one that we're all living in right now. So if that sounds familiar to you, just know that you're not alone. And it's also not too late to start planning for next time, for the future, to think about integrating that into your plan. So, in a situation where you're closed, your collection and the building housing your collection still has ongoing maintenance needs. And if left unchecked, your collection could suffer loss as a result. I just saw a really great article from the National Trust in the UK where they noticed that they had a surge in pest damage as the result of having their properties closed for the year. But they sort of anticipated that, and they had a monthly monitoring program in place. And so they were able to catch that problem early on and kind of implement some solutions when they started to see it happening so that it did not get massively out of control. So that's just a great example of how monitoring things can be very helpful. So if you are closed either for an extended period of time or maybe it's an unexpected closure, and that could happen, hopefully we don't have another pandemic, but maybe you're only open seasonally, maybe you have had a natural disaster or the power is out, or maybe it's something that's like kind of actually good, like you're undergoing some good some renovations and improvements to your building. You still need to make sure that you're monitoring your building and you're monitoring your collections for potential problems. And so hopefully you already have some of those monitoring programs in place where you're regularly checking on your environment and you're checking on pests. But make sure that you know who is going to be doing those things, what the schedule for doing them is. Do you have access to the building? Are you able to do some of that monitoring remotely? And if not, can you get access to the building? If you don't have access to the building, but maybe you have like security on site while you're closed, see if you can partner with them and have them be your eyes and ears and report back to you. That's always a great idea to involve kind of a variety of people at your institution and work together as a team. And then I would say while you're closed, don't forget about all that regular building maintenance of your roof and your drains and your gutters and things like that, because if you're not clearing dead leaves away and your drains get clogged up, that can lead to a flood. Same thing with gutters. Just kind of make sure that you're keeping up the building as much as possible. And then I would say if you don't have a disaster plan or a plan that addresses all of these things, there's no time like the present to get started on that. And if you need some help getting started, or if you need to update your existing plan and you need some motivation, I would say there are some great resources on the NEDCC website, and I would just encourage you to check those out. So that's it for me, and I'm very happy to take questions. We can either do that in the chat, or if people want to unmute themselves, I'm happy with that as well.
Thank you so much, Bex. This is great. And so just for people who might have to skate off, I dropped into the chat the link for the feedback form, and if you need credit, and then the link to the workshop website. And so it's got the handout and the resources that Bex was talking about. And I'll share my screen for just one more minute. And then we can, I'll pop off, I'll stop with the screen share just to give people one more opportunity to look at all the URLs of events that are upcoming and give you a chance to drink a little bit of water. And if people want to start putting questions in the chat, I have a lot of questions, but I would give other people a chance to go to the head of the line. But again, if you have a minute, take a minute and fill out the feedback form. Watch out for the upcoming webinars and join us at CineCon on April 9th, where we will be doing a highlights reel of all of the disaster planning workshops that have come before this one. So let me stop the screen share. And that way I can see you and see if people start to raise their hands. So if people aren't going to jump in, then I will. I was really shy in school. I was like not the person who raised my hand, and I'm not sure what happened. So so I'll just jump right in. So you, oh great. Oh, all right. So I will give over, but I have a philosophical question for you at the end. So let's see. Amy Hillick asks, do you have any suggestions for drains and other open and always wet places that could harbor mold?
That's a great question. So making sure those drains don't get clogged and back up into your space, I think is really key. And if you can clean at least the outside of the drains to tackle any mold, I think that's really great. But there is going to be mold in your environment, and hopefully you're not storing collections of materials right next to a drain. So I hope that answers your question, but yeah, that's sort of just inevitable.
Okay, thanks. If there's a follow-up, come back in the chat, but we'll move on to the next one from Bill Indersky. Apologies for my mispronouncing your last name. Bill says, our library is 85% books on acidic paper. Does this affect the mold problems, make it worse or better?
That's a great question. I think it really doesn't make much of a difference that whether the paper is acidic or alkaline, the mold is happy to digest whatever it can in terms of that organic material. And so really the thing is just to make sure those things don't get wet and that your area is not too humid, and that's going to really prevent mold growth more than anything else.
Great, thank you, Bill. So Tracy asks, other than vacuuming, do you use any other surface cleaning methods? And then she has a follow-up.
I think vacuuming is really the best thing to get off as much as you possibly can, because it's really going to physically remove it. Other surface cleaning methods, you know, if you're brushing things off, it's just going to brush things off into the air. It's not actually going to get rid of it the way that vacuuming does. So vacuuming is always the first step, and sometimes you can use other surface cleaning methods like a soft brush or a vulcanized rubber sponge, which you use dry, not wet, to remove soot and things like that. But you just need to be really, really careful that you're not picking up stuff on your sponge or your eraser and then transferring it to other parts of the same item or to other items for contamination reasons. So that's why vacuuming is really my preferred method. And you're not going to get, you're never going to get every single mold spore that exists. The idea is that by reducing the amount of mold on an item in the space, you're reducing the viability and the chances. So it's really like a risk mitigation strategy more than anything else.
Thank you. And so Tracy, also the follow-up question, does staining indicate inactive mold that can be reactivated?
Maybe. So if you see staining, you should check to see if you see any other visible signs of inactive mold, and if so, address those. But staining can be present long after that mold is gone or is no longer viable, and after cleaning, it really doesn't go away. And so that's a great argument, again, for marking or making a note in your catalog or your finding aid to let you know that those things have been cleaned or that the damage has been noted and it's been addressed.
Thank you. I just had, yes. So I've included the wrong URL for the evaluation form. So I will get a new evaluation form up unless people just want to go ahead and fill in the form now. And if I see the timestamp, I'll know which session you're responding to. But let me ask you a question and then I'll go take care of the form issue. So in talking with some other librarians in terms of, picking up on the risk mitigation that you were talking about, and early on in the presentation, you talked about, catastrophic flooding versus and causing mold damage versus a long-term kind of slow-moving issue. But I think some of the angst that they were bringing is they know that they've got a long-term issue, and so it's like maybe the question is more how to manage your own angst in terms of watching a problem occur in front of your eyes. And so, you talked about mitigation, and I picked up also on the monitoring that you were talking about at the end. But how do you deal with your personal angst about watching some of this kind of happen slowly?
Great question. It can be really hard because nobody has as much resources as they need or want. And so sometimes we just have to do the best that we can do, and that's all we can do, even if the best that we can do isn't the very, very best thing. And I think just being able to accept that is important. That doesn't mean you shouldn't strive for the best, but knowing that you have limitations based on staffing, based on resources, really based on money for most people. And so, just doing the best that you can with what you've got.
Yeah, that was so right. Maybe it's we all breathe, but wearing a respirator.
Yes.
So I think I have the form issue fixed. But let me ask another question that I had, and I think part of this is maybe this is a newbie question on my part. But when you said mold spreads quickly, so when you're checking a damage volume, let's say you've had a catastrophe and a flood, and maybe you see the books that are obviously wet and obviously have mold. But is there a certain distance that you should go out in terms of, this one's 2 feet out, 5 feet out, just to be careful? Or is kind of, if you see it, you have a problem, and if you don't, you've dodged one?
Excellent question. I think checking things in the immediate area, so things that are right next to it, are definitely you should do. Across the room, maybe not as much, but the caveat to that is maybe you have something and you have the air intake for your HVAC system is right next to it, then it has the potential to get into your HVAC system and spread. So a good place to check is like underneath your vents where air comes out. But it's also true that if you can't see it, you don't need to worry about it because there is mold everywhere all of the time. So if you can see that it's germinated and that it's growing, you need to worry. If you don't see anything, you can breathe easy with a respirator.
With the respirator.
Yeah.
And that was it's ironic, the convergence of mold and the pandemic, and how we all really do think about masks a whole lot more. But to that, as this series has talked about, libraries preparing for emergency and disasters and having kits ready in their buildings. Um, should libraries think about preemptively having their staff do fit testing for masks, to
Yes.
have that on hand?
Absolutely. And so that's a good thing to do actually on an annual basis to get fit tested, because just like everybody's face is a different size and shape, your face can actually change size if you have lots, or shape if you have lots of dental work, or if you gain or lose lots of weight. So having that done on an annual basis is what OSHA suggests or requires really that you do. And having that done preemptively is a great idea, so that when you are in a situation where you need to wear a mask, you are prepared.
Okay, and to that, you following up on a detail that you mentioned about the safety goggles, you said not vented. Is that, I heard that right?
Correct. Yeah. So you don't want them to be able to let air and mold in through the sides of the goggles into your eyes. You want them to have a good seal.
Okay. Do you have a preferred brand or a type, or just not to-
Really, just any safety goggles that are going to provide a seal. There are so many different types and brands out there, and again, some work with glasses, some don't. So it's to some degree a personal preference too.
Um, and then, so I'm watching the chat to see, and so far nobody's chiming in. So I'll just carry on until somebody chimes in with another question. And so something else I wondered, so if you're having to discard moldy items, it's just not going to work for you. Do you have some kind of, does the library have a responsibility to kind of package them up safely, or do you just throw it in the trash and you're done?
Yes, thank you. That's something that I forgot to mention, and I definitely meant to. So when you're discarding either moldy materials or your used mask and used gloves, or if you have a disposable piece of protective clothing, when you are done with it, you should put that in a plastic bag, tie it up, and throw it away outside your building. Don't leave that moldy, contaminated stuff like in the trash can next to your desk for the next 3 days. You want that to be away from you and to be outside. And I have known some libraries to, if they're discarding books because of mold, they will actually deface them to say, this item is moldy, do not take it. Because sometimes people, well-meaning people, even library staff, see a book in the trash and they get upset and they like want to save it. And so by doing that, to kind of warn people that this is being thrown away for a very specific reason.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm just going to add to that real quick that if you are wearing like a lab coat or an apron, something that's washable, that I bag that up and I take it and I wash it as soon as possible. Again, I don't just like leave that hanging up next to my coat in my office. I don't let that sit in my laundry at home. I want to take care of that as soon as possible.
And it sounds like you do your own coats. If there's a situation where the library decides, like, staff is going to kind of do our own cleaning, would you recommend people doing their own, washing their own coats, or should the library kind of take everything to a cleaners, or have a laundry service kind of deal with it?
I think either one is fine. Here at the center, we have a washer and dryer because we wash our lab coats and things frequently. In the past, I've just taken my own home and done that. I've also, working at a university, had linen services available through the university. So all of those things are acceptable, but it's certainly safe to take it home and wash it yourself. You would just want to do it like on hot.
Okay, thank you. And then two more kind of like, this is the freezing and kind of dealing with things as you find them. So can you freeze items indefinitely?
Yeah, pretty much. So that's one great reason that you want to wrap things before you put them in the freezer. so that you know and mark them so you know how long they've been in there. If you're using a frost-free freezer, then you don't need to worry about freezer burn. If you're not using a frost-free or self-defrosting freezer, things can potentially get freezer burn, and then when you go to thaw those out, potentially suffer more water damage. But pretty much you can just leave things in there indefinitely. But if you're going to leave them in there indefinitely or for, years at a time, maybe then you can consider withdrawing that.
Gotcha. And so the DIY part of me is like, when you talked about drying items, I'm like, well, why not bake them on a low heat? Though I understand there might be glue, but do you have an opinion? If it's like 5 items, could you bake them on low?
I generally prefer not to do that. One, because of adhesives, and two, like if you have metal security tags in there or RFID things that are magnetic in the oven, those are metal and possibility to ignite. But just even putting them like in an enclosed space or a room, or even making like a tent with plastic and putting a dehumidifier and fans in there can sometimes help dry things out faster.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. So I think we've exhausted, right, I think we've exhausted all of my questions, and I'll throw it back to the audience. If there's anything else you'd like to ask, pop it in the chat or raise your hand.
So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put my email address in the chat right now. And that way, if people have questions and you're shy about asking them publicly, or if you just think of something later and you want to email me, please feel free to do that. And I'm happy to talk to you later.
Okay. Well, thank you. So I think let's call it a wrap. Carolyn, I think you can stop recording now. I'll just say thank you to everybody for attending, and thank you to our presenter, Bex Caswell-Olson from NEDCC. And so this concludes our webinar. Please join us. We've got 2 more left.